June 6, 1944, 1840 hours, Sword Beach, Normandy, France. Klaus Weber raised his hands above his head, fingers trembling against the smoke-filled sky. Around him, the beach was chaos incarnate. Bodies lay scattered across the sand like broken dolls. The concrete bunker that had been his position for 3 days was now nothing more than rubble, destroyed by naval artillery that had pounded the coastline since dawn. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything except the crunch of boots approaching through the debris. 22 years old, a schoolteacher from Hamburg who had been drafted 2 years earlier. Klaus had never wanted to be a soldier. He had wanted to teach children about literature and history, to help them understand the world through books and ideas. Instead, he had spent the last 24 months learning how to kill, how to follow orders without question, and how to believe that the enemy was something less than human. Now the enemy stood before him. 3 British soldiers, rifles raised, faces covered in grime and exhaustion. Klaus closed his eyes and waited for the bullet. He had one final request, though he knew they would not understand his German. Make it quick. That was all he asked. After everything he had witnessed, after everything his country had done, he expected nothing less than immediate execution. But the bullet never came. Instead, rough hands patted him down, checking for weapons. Someone pulled the identification tags from around his neck. Another soldier gestured with his rifle toward a group of other German prisoners being assembled further up the beach. Klaus opened his eyes, confused. They were not going to shoot him. Not yet, at least. The British soldiers were professional, almost businesslike. No rage in their eyes, no screaming, no beatings. Just efficient processing of prisoners according to some protocol Klaus did not understand. Within 15 minutes, he was sitting in the back of a truck with 30 other captured Wehrmacht soldiers, all of them wearing the same expression of bewildered terror. The truck rumbled away from the beach, away from the battle, away from everything Klaus had known. As the sound of artillery faded behind them, he felt something he had not experienced in years. Not relief exactly, not hope, just the strange, disorienting sensation of still being alive when he had been certain he would die. What Klaus Weber could not have known, sitting in that truck on June 6, 1944, was that 6 months later he would be carving turkey at a Yorkshire family's Christmas table, teaching their daughter how to sing Silent Night in German, and experiencing a kindness that would shatter everything the Nazi propaganda machine had taught him about the enemy. For Klaus and hundreds of thousands of German soldiers like him, capture by British forces was supposed to mean torture, starvation, and death. That was what Goebbels had promised. That was what every German soldier had been told to expect if they fell into Allied hands. The propaganda broadcast had been explicit and relentless. The British were monsters who would show no mercy. The Americans were even worse. Surrender meant suffering beyond imagination, but propaganda, as Klaus would soon discover, had very little to do with reality. The journey from Normandy to England took 3 days. Klaus and his fellow prisoners were transported by ship across the English Channel, then loaded onto trains that carried them north through the British countryside. Through the windows, Klaus watched a nation at war, factories working around the clock, women in overalls doing jobs that men had once done, children playing in streets despite the rationing and hardship, but no destroyed cities, no rubble, no evidence of the total devastation that had consumed Germany. England was intact in ways that shocked him. Yes, there were bomb sites in some areas, evidence of the Luftwaffe's raids, but nothing like Hamburg, nothing like Berlin. The British had been at war for 5 years, yet their country still functioned. Their people still lived relatively normal lives. This was not what Klaus had been told. The propaganda had insisted that Britain was on the verge of collapse, that the German war machine had brought the island nation to its knees. Another lie. On July 3, 1944, Klaus arrived at Camp 174, located in the Yorkshire countryside near the village of Thornbury. The camp consisted of rows of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire fencing and guard towers. It looked like a prison, which is exactly what it was. But as Klaus would soon learn, it was a prison unlike any he had imagined. The processing began immediately. British officers who spoke fluent German explained the camp rules. Prisoners would be housed in barracks with adequate heating and sanitation. They would receive 3 meals per day. Medical care would be provided. They would be expected to work, but the work would be fair and compensated with small wages. Any prisoner who attempted escape would be punished, but not executed. Violence against guards or fellow prisoners would result in solitary confinement. And then came the statement that made Klaus certain he had misunderstood the translation. All treatment would be in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Klaus knew about the Geneva Convention. It was an international agreement about the humane treatment of prisoners of war. But he also knew that Germany had systematically violated every provision of that convention in its treatment of Soviet prisoners, Polish civilians, and countless others. The idea that the British would actually follow these rules, especially when dealing with German soldiers, seemed impossible. That first night, Klaus lay on a proper bed with clean sheets and a wool blanket. The barracks were cold but not freezing. There were latrines with running water. The other prisoners spoke in hushed voices, all of them sharing the same confusion. Where were the beatings? Where was the starvation? Where was the revenge they had been promised would come? The next morning brought another shock. Breakfast consisted of porridge, bread, margarine, and tea. Not a feast, certainly. Britain was under strict rationing, and the portions reflected wartime scarcity. But it was adequate. It was more food than Klaus had received during his final months in the Wehrmacht, when supply lines had collapsed and soldiers often went days with minimal rations. Klaus ate slowly, savoring every bite, waiting for someone to snatch the bowl away and reveal that this had all been some cruel joke. But no one came. The meal was real. The treatment was real. The British were actually following their own rules. Over the following weeks, Klaus began to understand the system. Camp 174 housed approximately 800 German prisoners, most of them captured during the Normandy invasion. The camp was run by British Army personnel under the command of Colonel James Hartley, a career officer who had fought in the First World War and had strong opinions about the proper treatment of prisoners. Colonel Hartley made his philosophy clear during a camp assembly in late July. Speaking through a German translator, he addressed the prisoners directly. "You are soldiers who fought for your country. We do not hate you for that. But your country committed terrible crimes, and those crimes cannot be ignored or forgiven. You will be treated fairly because we are civilized people who believe in the rule of law. You will be treated fairly because that is what separates us from the regime you served. You will be treated fairly because it is the right thing to do. But make no mistake, you are prisoners. You will work. You will follow orders. And you will remain here until this war is over and your country has been defeated." The speech was stern but not cruel. It acknowledged reality without dehumanizing the prisoners. For Klaus, it was the first time since his capture that someone had spoken to him as though he were still a human being, rather than simply an enemy to be destroyed. The work assignments began in August. Britain was desperate for labor. Millions of British men were serving in the armed forces, leaving massive shortages in agriculture, manufacturing, and infrastructure. German prisoners of war represented a solution to this problem. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could be required to work, provided the work was not directly related to military operations and the conditions were humane. Klaus was assigned to agricultural labor. Along with 20 other prisoners, he was transported each morning to farms in the surrounding countryside. The work was hard, harvesting potatoes, cutting hay, repairing fences, tending livestock. 8-hour days under the supervision of British guards and the farmers themselves. But the work was fair. The tools were adequate. There were breaks for water and rest. And at the end of each week, the prisoners received a small wage that could be used to purchase items from the camp canteen. It was during one of these work assignments that Klaus met George Thompson. George Thompson was 56 years old, a farmer who had worked the same land in Yorkshire for his entire life. His face was weathered by decades of sun and wind. His hands were calloused and strong. He spoke with a thick Yorkshire accent that Klaus initially found almost impossible to understand, and he had lost both of his sons in the war. Robert Thompson had died at El Alamein in 1942, killed by German artillery. William Thompson had died during the invasion of Sicily in 1943, shot by a German sniper. George Thompson had every reason to hate German soldiers, every reason to treat Klaus and the other prisoners with cruelty and contempt, but he did not. On Klaus's first day at the Thompson farm in early September 1944, George explained the work that needed to be done. The potato harvest was beginning, and it was backbreaking labor. Digging up the plants, sorting the potatoes, loading them into sacks, hauling the sacks to the barn. George demonstrated the technique, then handed Klaus a spade and pointed to the field. Klaus worked harder that day than he had worked in months, partly because he was afraid of what might happen if he slacked off, partly because he was grateful to be doing something productive rather than sitting in a camp, and partly because he could see George watching him, evaluating him, judging whether this German prisoner was worth the trouble. At midday, George's wife Margaret brought out tea and sandwiches. She was a thin woman with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her face was lined with grief, and she did not look at Klaus directly. She simply set the food down on a wooden crate, nodded to the British guard supervising the work detail, and walked back to the farmhouse without a word. Klaus ate the sandwich slowly, cheese and pickle on brown bread. Simple food, but it tasted like a gift. He drank the tea, strong and bitter, and felt warmth spread through his chest. For a moment, he allowed himself to think about his own wife, Anna, and their daughter, Greta. He had not heard from them in over a year. Hamburg had been heavily bombed. He did not know if they were alive or dead. The uncertainty was a constant ache that he carried with him every moment of every day. By the end of that first day, Klaus had proven himself. George Thompson was a man of few words, but as Klaus climbed into the truck to return to camp, George gave him a brief nod. It was not friendship, it was not forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. Klaus had worked hard and done the job properly. That was enough. September turned into October. The weather grew colder. The work continued. Klaus returned to the Thompson farm 3 days each week, always part of the same work detail. Gradually, he began to understand George's Yorkshire accent. He learned the English words for farming tools and tasks: spade, rake, plow, harvest, fence, gate, barn. George began to teach him more complex phrases: how to ask questions, how to report problems, how to understand instructions without needing the guard to translate. The lessons were practical, not friendly. George was not trying to befriend Klaus. He was simply trying to make the work more efficient. But something was shifting. Klaus could feel it. The way George sometimes corrected his English pronunciation with patience rather than irritation. The way Margaret occasionally left extra food with the midday meal. The way George's daughter Sarah, a 16-year-old girl with her father's strong features and her mother's sad eyes, sometimes watched the prisoners working from the farmhouse window. In early November, a storm hit Yorkshire. Heavy rain and wind battered the countryside for 3 days straight. On the second day of the storm, Klaus and the other prisoners were still sent to the Thompson farm. There was work that could not wait. A section of fence had collapsed and sheep were in danger of wandering onto the road. Klaus and 2 other prisoners worked alongside George in the driving rain, hammering posts into the muddy ground, stringing wire, herding the panicked sheep back into the pasture. The work took hours. By the time they finished, all of them were soaked through and shivering. George looked at Klaus for a long moment, then made a decision. He gestured toward the barn and said something Klaus did not fully understand. The British guard, a young corporal named Davies who had grown accustomed to the routine, nodded his approval. George led Klaus and the other prisoners into the barn, where it was dry and relatively warm. He brought out old blankets and told them to dry off. Then he disappeared into the farmhouse and returned with a pot of hot soup and chunks of bread. The prisoners ate in silence, grateful for the warmth and the food. George sat on a hay bale watching them. After a while, he spoke. His words were slow and deliberate, chosen carefully so Klaus might understand. "You work hard. Fair work deserves fair treatment." Klaus looked up, meeting George's eyes for the first time. He wanted to say something, to thank him, to apologize for the war, for the deaths of George's sons, for everything. But his English was not good enough, and the words felt inadequate anyway. So he simply nodded and said the one phrase he had learned well: "Thank you." George nodded back. Then he stood up, collected the empty bowls, and returned to his work. But something had changed. Klaus could feel it. This was no longer just a farmer and a prisoner. This was something more complicated. Something almost human. As November progressed, Klaus noticed other changes. Margaret Thompson began to speak to him occasionally, asking simple questions about the work or offering brief instructions. Sarah sometimes brought the midday tea instead of her mother, and she was curious in the way young people are curious, asking Klaus about Germany, about his life before the war, about whether he had a family. Klaus answered as best he could with his limited English. Yes, he had been a teacher. Yes, he had a wife and daughter. No, he did not know if they were alive. Hamburg had been bombed many times. He had received no letters. He did not know. Sarah's face fell when he said this. She understood loss. Her brothers were gone. Many people in the village had lost someone. The war had touched everyone. One afternoon in late November, as Klaus was loading sacks of potatoes into the barn, George approached him with a question that caught him completely off guard. "Do you believe in God?" Klaus paused, unsure if he had understood correctly. He set down the sack and turned to face George. The older man's expression was serious, searching. Klaus thought carefully before answering. His English was improving, but this was a complex question. He chose his words slowly. "I do not know. The war makes it hard to believe." George nodded, as though this was the answer he had expected. He was quiet for a moment, then spoke again. "My wife believes. She prays every night for our boys. She prays for the war to end. She prays for peace." Klaus did not know what to say to this. He waited. George continued. "Christmas is coming. Margaret wants to invite you to dinner. Christmas Day. At our house." Klaus stared at him, certain he had misunderstood. The English words had been clear enough, but the meaning seemed impossible. Invite him to Christmas dinner? A German prisoner? In the home of a man whose sons had been killed by Germans? George saw his confusion and repeated himself, more slowly this time. "Margaret wants you to come to our house for Christmas dinner. She says it is the Christian thing to do. She says no one should be alone at Christmas." Klaus felt something break inside his chest. Not pain exactly. Something else. Something he had not felt in so long that he had almost forgotten what it was called. Kindness. Simple, uncomplicated human kindness. He tried to speak, but his voice caught. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I would be honored. Thank you." George nodded, looking almost embarrassed by the emotion in Klaus's voice. He turned away and went back to work, leaving Klaus standing alone in the barn, trying to process what had just happened. That night, back at Camp 174, Klaus lay on his bunk and thought about Christmas. He had not celebrated Christmas properly in years. The Wehrmacht had discouraged religious observance, replacing it with Nazi ideology and military ritual. And even before that, the war had made celebration feel obscene. How could you celebrate peace and goodwill when the world was tearing itself apart? But now, impossibly, he had been invited to share Christmas with a British family, with people who had every reason to hate him, with people who had lost their sons to the war he had fought in. Klaus did not sleep much that night. He kept thinking about Anna and Greta. He wondered if they were still alive. He wondered if they were celebrating Christmas, or if Hamburg was too destroyed for such things. He wondered if he would ever see them again. December arrived with cold winds and gray skies. The work at the Thompson farm continued, but now there was an undercurrent of anticipation. Sarah mentioned the upcoming Christmas dinner several times, clearly excited about the unusual event. Margaret began preparing, making lists of ingredients and calculating how to stretch their rations to accommodate an extra guest. Not everyone in the Thompson family was comfortable with the decision. George's brother, who lived in the village, thought it was madness to invite a German into their home. Some of the neighbors expressed similar concerns, but Margaret was firm. It was Christmas. It was the right thing to do. And that was the end of the discussion. On December 25, 1944, Klaus Weber walked through the front door of the Thompson farmhouse for the first time. He had been given permission by the camp commandant, escorted by Corporal Davies, who would wait outside during the meal. Klaus wore his cleanest clothes, though they were still prison issue and marked him clearly as a POW. He carried nothing except a small wooden carving he had made in the camp workshop, a simple bird that he intended to give to the family as a gift. The farmhouse was warm and smelled of roasting meat. A small Christmas tree stood in the corner of the sitting room, decorated with handmade ornaments and a few precious glass baubles that had survived from before the war. Margaret greeted him at the door with a nervous smile. George shook his hand formally. Sarah grinned and immediately began asking him questions about German Christmas traditions. The meal was modest by pre-war standards, but extraordinary given the circumstances. Turkey roasted with herbs, potatoes and carrots from the farm, gravy made from careful hoarding of fat and flour, bread, and for dessert, a small Christmas pudding that Margaret had been saving ingredients for all year. They sat around the table, the Thompson family and their German prisoner, and for a moment no one knew quite what to say. The situation was so strange, so unprecedented, that normal conversation seemed impossible. Then George cleared his throat and spoke. "In this house we say grace before meals. You do not have to participate if you do not wish to, but it is our custom." Klaus nodded. "Please, I will join you." They bowed their heads. George's voice was rough but sincere. "Lord, we thank you for this food and for the hands that prepared it. We thank you for bringing us together on this day. We remember those who are not with us. We pray for peace and for an end to this terrible war. Amen. Amen," the others echoed, Klaus included. The meal began. At first, conversation was stilted and awkward, but gradually, as the food was passed and plates were filled, people began to relax. Sarah asked Klaus about his work as a teacher. What subjects had he taught? What were German schools like? Did he enjoy teaching? Klaus answered as best he could, his English improving with each sentence. He had taught literature and history to children aged 10 to 14. He had loved helping young minds discover the joy of reading and learning. He had wanted to inspire them to think critically and question the world around them. Margaret asked about his family. Klaus's voice grew quiet as he spoke about Anna and Greta. His wife had been a nurse before the war. His daughter had been 7 years old the last time he saw her. That was 3 years ago, before he was drafted. He had received a few letters in the first year, but then nothing. Hamburg had been bombed repeatedly. He did not know if they had survived. The table fell silent. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Sarah reached across and squeezed Klaus's hand briefly before pulling back, embarrassed by her own gesture. George stared at his plate, his jaw tight. After a long moment, George spoke. "War takes from everyone. German, British, it does not matter. We all lose people we love." Klaus nodded, unable to speak. The meal continued. The mood lightened somewhat as Sarah insisted on teaching Klaus English Christmas carols. They sang Silent Night, which Klaus knew in German as Stille Nacht. His voice was rough and uncertain, but he sang anyway, the familiar words bringing back memories of Christmases long ago, before the war, before everything had fallen apart. When the meal was finished and the dishes were cleared, Margaret brought out the Christmas pudding. It was small, barely enough for 4 people, but she divided it carefully and served each person an equal portion. Klaus protested that he should not take a share, that this was their family tradition and he was just a guest, an outsider, a prisoner. But Margaret would not hear of it. "You are at our table on Christmas Day. That makes you part of this, whether you like it or not." Klaus ate the pudding slowly, savoring every bite. It was sweet and rich, filled with dried fruit and spices that must have cost a fortune on the black market, or been saved for months. It tasted like kindness. It tasted like forgiveness. It tasted like something Klaus had thought was lost forever. As the evening drew to a close, Klaus presented his gift, the small wooden bird, carved with care during long evenings in the camp workshop. It was not much, but it was all he had to offer. Margaret accepted it with tears in her eyes. She placed it on the mantelpiece, next to photographs of Robert and William in their uniforms. "Thank you," she said simply. "We will treasure it." Corporal Davies knocked on the door, indicating it was time to return to camp. Klaus stood, shook hands with George, thanked Margaret and Sarah, and walked out into the cold December night. As the truck drove back toward Camp 174, Klaus sat in silence, overwhelmed by what had just happened. He had expected revenge. He had expected hatred. He had expected to be treated as the enemy, as something less than human. Instead, he had been invited into a home, fed at a family table, and shown a kindness that defied everything he had been taught about the British. That night, lying on his bunk in the barracks, Klaus Weber cried for the first time since his capture. Not from sadness, though there was plenty of that. Not from fear, though uncertainty about his family haunted him constantly. He cried from the overwhelming realization that the propaganda had been lies. All of it. The British were not monsters. They were people. Complicated, grieving, generous people who had chosen to extend humanity to someone who wore the uniform of their enemy. Klaus's experience was not unique. Across Britain, similar scenes were playing out in hundreds of homes. German prisoners of war being invited to Christmas dinners, Sunday lunches, village celebrations. It was not universal. Many British families wanted nothing to do with German prisoners, and that was understandable given the suffering the war had caused. But enough families extended these invitations that it became a recognized phenomenon, documented in letters, diaries, and official reports. The reasons for this generosity were complex. Partly it was Christian charity, the belief that even enemies deserved basic human dignity, especially during religious holidays. Partly it was practical. The prisoners worked on British farms and in British communities. Daily contact made it harder to maintain hatred. When you worked alongside someone, when you saw them as individuals rather than abstract enemies, it became difficult to sustain the dehumanization that war required. And partly it was cultural. The British had a strong tradition of fair play and proper conduct even toward enemies. This was not universal, and there were certainly instances of mistreatment and abuse. But the prevailing attitude among British authorities and much of the civilian population was that prisoners should be treated according to the rules, that civilization meant maintaining standards even when it would be easier to abandon them. The policy came from the top. Winston Churchill himself had insisted that German prisoners be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention, both because it was the right thing to do and because it served strategic purposes. Fair treatment of German prisoners encouraged more Germans to surrender rather than fight to the death. It provided moral high ground in the propaganda war, and it set a standard that Churchill hoped would protect British prisoners held by Germany, though this hope was often disappointed. By the end of 1944, approximately 400,000 German prisoners of war were being held in Britain. They were housed in camps across the country, from Scotland to Cornwall, from Wales to East Anglia. The camps varied in size and conditions, but all were required to meet minimum standards: adequate food, shelter, medical care, and humane treatment. The work program was extensive. German prisoners worked on farms, in forests, in quarries, on construction projects. They repaired roads, dug drainage ditches, harvested crops, and performed countless other tasks that kept Britain's wartime economy functioning. The work was hard, but it was fair. 8-hour days, rest periods, safety equipment, wages. Medical care was provided according to the same standards as British soldiers. Camp hospitals treated everything from minor injuries to serious illnesses. Surgeries were performed when necessary. Antibiotics, which were precious and in short supply, were used to treat German prisoners just as they were used to treat British patients. The mortality rate among German POWs in Britain was less than 0.3%, lower than the mortality rate among the British civilian population during the same period. This was in stark contrast to the treatment of prisoners in German camps. Soviet prisoners of war held by Germany died by the millions, victims of starvation, disease, exposure, and outright murder. The Nazi regime had explicitly rejected the Geneva Convention when it came to Soviet prisoners, declaring them subhuman and unworthy of protection. Even Western Allied prisoners, who were theoretically protected by the convention, often faced harsh conditions and inadequate care. The contrast was not lost on German prisoners in Britain. Men like Klaus, who had been taught that the Allies were barbaric and cruel, found themselves confronted with a reality that contradicted everything they had been told. This cognitive dissonance was profound, and for many, transformative. Klaus returned to the Thompson farm after Christmas, and the relationship continued to evolve. George began to teach him carpentry skills during slow periods. Margaret occasionally asked his opinion on household matters, treating him less like a prisoner and more like a farmhand. Sarah practiced her German with him, preparing for university studies she hoped to pursue after the war. In February 1945, Klaus developed pneumonia. The camp doctor diagnosed it quickly and began treatment with antibiotics. Within 2 weeks, Klaus had recovered fully. The care he received was professional and thorough, identical to what a British soldier would have received. When he returned to work at the Thompson farm, Margaret fussed over him, insisting he take frequent breaks and avoid overexertion until he had fully regained his strength. Klaus was allowed to write letters home, though they were censored by camp authorities. In March 1945, he wrote to Anna, not knowing if she would ever receive it. He described his capture, his treatment, the work on the farm, the Christmas dinner. He told her about the Thompson family and their kindness. He told her that he was safe and that he hoped desperately that she and Greta were safe as well. The letter was one of thousands sent by German prisoners to their families in Germany. These letters had an unintended but significant impact. They contradicted Nazi propaganda about Allied brutality. They provided evidence that surrender to the British or Americans was not a death sentence. As these letters circulated in Germany, they undermined faith in the Nazi regime's claims and may have contributed to increased surrender rates in the final months of the war. On May 8, 1945, the war in Europe ended. Klaus heard the news in the camp, announced over loudspeakers by Colonel Hartley. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The Third Reich was finished. Hitler was dead. Klaus felt a complicated mix of emotions: relief that the killing was over, shame at what his country had done, fear about what would happen next, and uncertainty about his own future. What would become of the prisoners now? Would they be sent home immediately? Would they be punished for the crimes of the Nazi regime? Would there even be a home to return to? The answers came slowly. Repatriation would not be immediate. Germany was in ruins, occupied by Allied forces, struggling with food shortages and infrastructure collapse. The British government decided that German prisoners would remain in Britain for the time being, continuing their work assignments while the situation in Germany stabilized. For Klaus, this meant continuing to work at the Thompson farm. The war was over, but his daily routine remained largely unchanged. He still rose early, traveled to the farm, worked alongside George, ate meals provided by Margaret, and returned to camp in the evening. But something had shifted. He was no longer a prisoner of war exactly. The war was over. He was now simply a prisoner, held in a country that was trying to figure out what to do with hundreds of thousands of former enemy soldiers. In June 1945, Klaus received news that shattered him: a letter from a neighbor in Hamburg, forwarded through the Red Cross. Anna and Greta had been killed in July 1943 during Operation Gomorrah, the massive bombing raid that had destroyed much of Hamburg and killed over 40,000 people. They had been in a shelter that took a direct hit. Death had been instantaneous. Klaus read the letter 3 times before the words fully registered. Then he walked out of the barracks, found a quiet spot behind one of the buildings, and collapsed. He did not cry. He did not scream. He simply sat on the ground, staring at nothing, feeling as though everything inside him had been hollowed out. George Thompson found him there 2 hours later. The farmer had come to the camp to speak with the commandant about extending Klaus's work assignment. When he heard what had happened, he sat down next to Klaus without a word. They sat together in silence for a long time. Finally, George spoke. "I am sorry. No one should lose their family like that." Klaus nodded, unable to speak. George continued, "You will get through this. I do not know how, but you will. Because you must. Because that is what we do. We survive. We keep going." Klaus looked at him, this British farmer who had lost his own sons, who had every reason to hate Germans, who had instead shown him kindness and now sat with him in his grief. "I have nothing left," Klaus said quietly. "No family, no home, nothing." George was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that would change Klaus's life. "You have work. You have a place at my farm for as long as you need it. That is something." Over the following months, Klaus threw himself into work. It was the only thing that kept him from drowning in grief. He worked longer hours than required. He volunteered for extra projects. He learned new skills: carpentry, masonry, animal husbandry. George taught him patiently, and Klaus absorbed everything like a man desperate for purpose. The Thompson family became, in a strange way, his anchor. Margaret treated him with maternal concern, making sure he ate properly and did not work himself to exhaustion. Sarah shared books with him, helping him improve his English through literature. George offered quiet companionship, the solidarity of 2 men who had both lost everything and were trying to figure out how to keep living. In 1946, the British government began the formal process of repatriation. German prisoners were given the option to return to Germany, or in certain cases to apply for permission to remain in Britain as civilian workers. The decision was not easy. Germany was still in chaos, divided into occupation zones, struggling with food shortages and economic collapse. But it was home. It was where Klaus had been born, where he had lived his entire life before the war. Except that home no longer existed. Hamburg was a ruin. His family was gone. His teaching position no longer existed. The Germany he had known was dead, replaced by something he did not recognize and was not sure he wanted to be part of. Klaus applied for permission to remain in Britain as a civilian agricultural worker. The application was approved in early 1947. He was released from Camp 174 and became a legal resident, employed full-time by George Thompson. He moved into a small cottage on the Thompson property, a two-room building that had once housed a farmhand, but had been empty for years. It was the first time since 1942 that Klaus had lived in a space that was truly his own. He furnished it simply with items donated by the Thompson family and other villagers. A bed, a table, 2 chairs, a small stove. It was not much, but it was enough. Klaus began to integrate into village life. He attended church services with the Thompson family. He went to the local pub on Friday evenings, where he gradually became accepted by the other regulars. He helped with community projects, repairing the village hall roof and building new fences around the school playground. Not everyone welcomed him. There were people in the village who had lost loved ones in the war and who could not forgive or forget. Klaus understood this. He did not push himself on anyone. He simply worked hard, kept his head down, and tried to be a good neighbor. In 1948, Klaus met Margaret Wilson. She was a schoolteacher in the village, 32 years old, unmarried. She had lost her fiancé at Dunkirk and had resigned herself to spinsterhood, but she was intelligent, kind, and shared Klaus's love of literature and education. They met at a village library fundraiser. Margaret was organizing a book sale, and Klaus had donated several German books from his small collection. They began talking about literature, about teaching, about the challenges of education in the post-war world. The conversation lasted 2 hours. They began seeing each other regularly. Walks in the countryside, dinners at the pub, long conversations about books and ideas. Margaret knew Klaus's history. Everyone in the village knew, but she saw past the uniform he had once worn to the man he was trying to become. In December 1949, Klaus and Margaret were married in the village church. George Thompson walked Margaret down the aisle, her own father having died years earlier. Sarah was the maid of honor. The ceremony was small and simple, attended by about 30 people. It was a statement of hope, of new beginnings, of the possibility of building something good from the ruins of the past. Klaus became a British citizen in 1952. He returned to teaching, working as a German language instructor at a secondary school in the nearby town. He was good at his job, patient and knowledgeable, able to help students understand not just the language but the culture and history behind it. He and Margaret had 2 children, a son born in 1951 and a daughter born in 1953. Klaus was a devoted father, determined to give his children the stability and love that had been stolen from Greta. He told them about their half-sister, about Anna, about the family that had been lost. He wanted them to understand where they came from, even the painful parts. Klaus maintained his friendship with the Thompson family for the rest of his life. George died in 1967, and Klaus was a pallbearer at his funeral. Margaret Thompson died in 1973, and Klaus delivered a eulogy that brought the entire church to tears. Sarah remained a close friend until Klaus's own death, visiting regularly and maintaining the connection between their families. In 1987, Klaus was interviewed by a local historian documenting the experiences of former German POWs who had settled in Britain. The interview was recorded and later deposited in the Imperial War Museum archives. In it, Klaus spoke about his capture, his time at Camp 174, his work on the Thompson farm, and the Christmas dinner that had changed his understanding of what civilization meant. "They taught me what civilization means," Klaus said in the interview, his English now flawless but still carrying a trace of German accent. "Not through propaganda or speeches, but through actions, through kindness when they could have chosen cruelty, through fairness when they could have chosen revenge. The British did not defeat me with weapons. They defeated me with decency, and in doing so, they gave me a second chance at life." Klaus Weber died in 2001 at the age of 79. He was buried in the churchyard of the village where he had lived for over 50 years, next to his wife Margaret. The Thompson family plot was nearby, and Klaus had often said he wanted to rest close to the people who had saved him. His story was one of thousands. Approximately 25,000 German prisoners of war chose to remain in Britain after World War II. They married British women, raised British children, became British citizens. They worked as farmers, teachers, engineers, shopkeepers. They integrated into communities across the country, from Scotland to Cornwall, from Wales to East Anglia. Their presence was a testament to something remarkable. In the aftermath of the most destructive war in human history, in a nation that had suffered bombing, rationing, and the loss of hundreds of thousands of its citizens, there was still room for mercy, still capacity for forgiveness, still willingness to see former enemies as human beings deserving of dignity and a second chance. This was not universal. There were instances of mistreatment, abuse, and injustice. There were British people who could never forgive or forget. There were German prisoners who remained unrepentant Nazis, who rejected the kindness shown to them, who returned to Germany as soon as possible to rebuild the ideology that had caused so much suffering. But there were also people, like the Thompson family, people who had lost everything but still found the strength to extend humanity to someone who wore the uniform of their enemy, people who understood that revenge might feel satisfying in the moment, but that civilization required something more difficult and more important. The British policy toward German prisoners of war was not perfect. It was shaped by strategic considerations as much as moral ones. It was easier to be generous when you were winning the war. It was easier to follow the rules when you had the resources to do so. And it was easier to treat German prisoners well when they were white Europeans rather than colonial subjects or people of color, a double standard that cannot be ignored. But within those limitations and contradictions, something meaningful happened. Hundreds of thousands of men who expected death or torture received instead fair treatment, adequate care, and in many cases, genuine kindness. Thousands of British families who had every reason to hate chose instead to see individuals rather than enemies. And from those choices came stories like Klaus Weber's, stories of transformation and redemption, and the stubborn human capacity for decency, even in the darkest times. The Christmas dinner at the Thompson farm in 1944 was not a grand gesture. It was a simple meal shared by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. But it represented something profound. It represented the choice to maintain civilization when it would have been easier to abandon it. It represented the belief that even enemies are human beings deserving of basic dignity. And it represented the possibility that kindness, not cruelty, might be the most powerful weapon of all. Klaus Weber expected British revenge. Instead, he got invited to a family dinner. And in that invitation, in that simple act of hospitality extended across the chasm of war and hatred, he found not just survival, but redemption. He found not just shelter, but home. He found not just tolerance, but belonging. That is the story of Klaus Weber. But it is also the story of George and Margaret Thompson, who chose mercy over vengeance. It is the story of Sarah Thompson, who saw past uniforms to the person underneath. It is the story of Colonel Hartley and Corporal Davies and countless other British soldiers and officials who followed the rules even when it would have been easier not to. It is the story of Margaret Wilson, who loved a former enemy and built a life with him. And it is the story of a nation that, despite suffering and loss, maintained its commitment to civilization and human dignity. In the end, that may be the most important lesson of all. War brings out the worst in humanity, but it can also, in unexpected moments, bring out the best. And sometimes the greatest victories are not won on battlefields, but at dinner tables, where former enemies break bread together and discover that they are, after all, simply human beings trying to survive in a broken world. Klaus Weber died believing that the British had saved his life twice. Once when they captured him, instead of killing him. And once when they invited him to Christmas dinner and showed him that there was still goodness in the world, still reason to hope, still possibility for redemption. He spent the rest of his life trying to live up to that gift. And in doing so, he became living proof that even in the aftermath of the worst war in human history, humanity could still triumph over hatred, and kindness could still change the world, one dinner invitation at a time.